The transport ship carved through the grey Pacific waters on the morning of August 23, 1945. Beneath the deck, in a cramped hold that smelled of salt, rust, and fear, 47 Japanese women sat in silence. They were military nurses, clerical workers, comfort station managers, and radio operators captured across the collapsing perimeter of the Japanese Empire. Some had been pulled from burning buildings in Manila. Others had surrendered in caves on Saipan, or been found half-starved in the jungles of Okinawa. Their uniforms were tattered, their faces hollow, their hands trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of what they believed awaited them. They had been taught since childhood what happened to women taken by the enemy. The stories were explicit, horrifying, passed down through military indoctrination and whispered in barracks late at night. Rape, torture, humiliation, death. They clutched small possessions, a photograph, a silk handkerchief, a broken command, prepared themselves for the end. One woman, a 23-year-old army nurse named Takahashi Fumiko, stared at the sliver of light coming through the porthole. She had watched soldiers die in her arms in the Philippines, had seen entire hospital wards consumed by fire, had walked barefoot through mud and blood to reach the evacuation point. She expected nothing from the Americans. She expected less than nothing. In her mind, she replayed the final instructions given by her commanding officer before his suicide. Do not let them take you alive. If capture is inevitable, end it with honor. She had not ended it. She had chosen survival, though she could not explain why. Now, as the engines thrummed beneath her feet and the ship carried her toward an unknown destination, she wondered if that choice had been a mistake. The door to the hold opened with a metallic groan. Bright light spilled in. The women flinched, shielding their eyes. An American soldier stood silhouetted in the doorway, young, clean-shaven, holding a clipboard. He spoke in halting Japanese, his pronunciation clumsy but his tone polite. Please follow me. Bring your belongings. No one will harm you. The women exchanged glances. Some began to weep. Others stared ahead with expressions carved from stone. They rose slowly, unsteadily, and filed up the narrow staircase into the blinding sun. What Takahashi Fumiko saw when she emerged onto the deck did not align with anything she had been told. The American sailors who watched them climb out did not leer or shout. They looked away, busied themselves with ropes and equipment, offered awkward nods. One young sailor met her eyes for a moment, then quickly turned his head, as though embarrassed. A medical officer, a woman in a crisp white uniform, approached and spoke gently through an interpreter. You will be taken to a processing center. You will be examined by female doctors. You will be given clean clothes and food. You are prisoners of war. You will be treated in accordance with international law. The words felt surreal, impossible. Takahashi wanted to believe them. She did not dare. This moment, this first contact between female Japanese prisoners of war and their American captors, marked the beginning of an experience so profoundly disorienting that many of these women would spend decades trying to reconcile it with everything they had been taught about the enemy. They had been raised in an empire that framed the war as a sacred struggle between civilization and barbarism, between the divine order of the East and the corrupt decadence of the West. They had been told that Americans were savages, that Western soldiers treated women as objects, that surrender meant a fate worse than death. They had been taught to fear the enemy not merely as a military opponent but as a moral threat, a force of chaos and cruelty that would defile everything they held sacred. And now, as they stepped off the transport ship onto the dock at a prisoner of war processing center in the Philippines, they entered a reality that contradicted every lesson they had absorbed. The first shock came within hours. After disembarkation, the women were led through a series of canvas tents, where female military personnel conducted medical examinations. Takahashi had braced herself for violence, for the violation she had been promised would come. Instead, the American nurse who examined her was methodical, professional, almost maternal. She checked for malnutrition, dehydration, parasitic infections. She applied antiseptic to wounds. She spoke softly, though Takahashi understood little of the English. When the examination was finished, the nurse handed her a small paper packet. Inside were soap, a toothbrush, toothpaste, a comb, and a bar of chocolate. Takahashi stared at the chocolate, turning it over in her hands. It was wrapped in brown paper, stamped with English words. It was absurdly ordinary, impossibly generous. She did not eat it for 3 days, convinced it was poisoned or part of some elaborate trap. When she finally broke off a corner and tasted it, the sweetness overwhelmed her. She sat on the edge of her cot and wept. The prisoner of war camp, where these women were eventually housed, was located on the outskirts of a recaptured Philippine city. A sprawling complex of prefabricated barracks, mess halls, and administrative buildings surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. It was designed to hold several thousand detainees, most of them men. But a separate section had been established for the female prisoners. The barracks were simple but clean, with cots arranged in rows, windows that opened to let in air, and latrines that functioned. Compared to the conditions these women had endured during the final months of the wars, leaping in caves, eating grass and tree bark, drinking contaminated water, the camp seemed almost absurdly comfortable. But comfort was the least of the contradictions they encountered. The food was the first thing that broke through their disbelief. 3 times a day, the prisoners were fed meals prepared in the camp kitchens: rice, bread, canned vegetables, meat, fruit, milk, coffee. The portions were not large by American standards, but by the standards of wartime Japan, they were staggering. Takahashi, who had not seen fresh fruit in over a year, stared at an orange as though it were a precious gem. She had watched comrades die of malnutrition. She had traded her last family heirloom for a handful of rotten sweet potatoes. And now, here, in an enemy prison camp, she was being given food that Japanese civilians could only dream of. The irony was almost unbearable. One evening, a week into her captivity, Takahashi sat in the mess hall with a group of other prisoners, picking at a plate of stew. The woman next to her, a former radio operator named Sato Keiko, spoke in a low voice. "They are fattening us for something. This cannot last." Another woman, older, a widow who had worked as a clerical assistant in the Imperial Army headquarters in Manila, shook her head. "I do not think so. I think this is simply how they are. I think they have so much that they do not know what scarcity means." Takahashi said nothing. She thought about the lessons she had been taught in school. The propaganda posters that depicted Americans as gluttonous, wasteful, obsessed with material excess. She had dismissed those images as exaggerations, the crude caricatures of a desperate government. But now, seeing the casual abundance of the camphor, discarded food, scraped into waste bins, the endless supply of soap and toilet paper, the way the guards complained about the quality of their own rations, she realized that those caricatures had been based on a kernel of truth. The Americans were not cruel or sadistic. They were simply wealthy beyond comprehension, and that wealth, more than any weapon, was a kind of power. The second shock, deeper and more destabilizing, came from the behavior of the American personnel. The guards were polite. They greeted the prisoners in the morning, wished them good night in the evening, spoke to them as though they were human beings rather than enemies. The medical staff treated injuries and illnesses without prejudice. The administrative officers processed paperwork with bureaucratic efficiency, ensuring that the prisoners' names and records were documented according to Geneva Convention protocols. There were rules, of course, curfews, inspections, restrictions on movement, but they were enforced with a curious gentleness. When a prisoner violated a rule, the punishment was typically a reprimand or a temporary loss of privileges, not beatings or solitary confinement. Takahashi, who had served in a military hierarchy where discipline was maintained through fear and violence, found this incomprehensible. How could an army function without cruelty? How could authority exist without terror? She posed this question one afternoon to a Japanese-American interpreter, a Nisei woman named Grace Yamada, who had been assigned to the camp to facilitate communication. Grace was in her mid-30s, born in California, educated at Berkeley, fluent in both English and Japanese. She moved between the two worlds with an ease that Takahashi found both fascinating and unsettling. It is not that they do not have discipline, Grace explained. It is that their discipline is different. In the American military, soldiers are expected to follow orders, but they are also expected to think for themselves. They are trained to question, to adapt, to take initiative. Blind obedience is not valued in the same way. Takahashi struggled to process this. But how can an army function if soldiers are allowed to question orders? Grace smiled faintly. That is what the Japanese High Command thought, and yet, here we are. The conversations with Grace became a lifeline for Takahashi. Through her, Takahashi began to understand the fundamental ideological gulf that separated the world. She had known from the world she now inhabited. Grace explained concepts that had no direct equivalent in Japanese. Democracy, individual rights, due process, the rule of law. She described a society where authority was not absolute, where power was checked and balanced, where citizens could criticize their government without fear of execution. Takahashi listened with a mixture of skepticism and wonder. It sounded utopian, impossible. And yet, the evidence surrounded her. The camp operated on principles that were alien to her experience but undeniably effective. Decisions were made through consultation and consensus. Disputes were resolved through procedures and hearings. Even the guards, who held power over the prisoners, were themselves subject to oversight and accountability. It was a system built not on fear but on trust, and it functioned with a smoothness that defied everything Takahashi had been taught about human nature. The third shock, perhaps the most profound, came from the presence of women in positions of authority. Takahashi had grown up in a society where women's roles were rigidly defined: wife, mother, supporter of men. She had joined the military as a nurse because it was one of the few acceptable paths for an unmarried woman. But even within the military, women were subordinate, auxiliary, expected to serve without ambition. The American camp shattered that framework. Female officers ran administrative sections. Female doctors made medical decisions. Female guards patrolled the perimeter with the same authority as their male counterparts. And most striking of all, they were treated with respect by the men around them. Takahashi watched, astonished, as a young female lieutenant gave orders to a group of male soldiers, and they obeyed without hesitation or resentment. She watched as female nurses debated treatment protocols with male doctors. Their opinions weighed equally. She watched as women moved through the camp with confidence, purpose, autonomy. It was a revelation that cut deeper than any political ideology. If women could be this in America, what did that mean for the world she had left behind? One afternoon, Takahashi was summoned to the camp's main administrative building for an interview. She was led into a small office where a female captain named Margaret Thornton sat behind a desk, reviewing documents. Captain Thornton was in her early 40s, with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. She gestured for Takahashi to sit, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos. "I understand you speak some English," she said through the interpreter. "A little," Takahashi admitted. Captain Thornton nodded. "I'm conducting interviews to understand the experiences of female peers. I want to know what you need, what concerns you have, how we can improve conditions here. Your answers will be confidential. They will be used only to inform camp policy." Takahashi hesitated. In the Japanese military, such interviews were traps, opportunities for superiors to identify dissenters and punish dissent. But Captain Thornton's demeanor was open, patient. She waited, sipping her coffee, allowing the silence to stretch. Finally, Takahashi spoke. "I do not understand why you treat us this way. We are your enemies. We fought against you. Why do you give us food, medicine, safety? Why do you not punish us?" Captain Thornton set down her cup. "Because you are prisoners of war, and under international law, you are entitled to humane treatment. Because you are human beings, and we believe human beings have certain inalienable rights. And because we believe that how we treat our enemies says more about who we are than it does about who they are." Takahashi stared at her. The interpreter translated the words carefully, but their meaning felt slippery, elusive. Rights, humanity, identity. These were not concepts that had shaped her understanding of war. War, as she had known it, was about domination, sacrifice, survival. It was about the strong subduing the weak, about loyalty unto death, about the subsumption of the individual into the collective. The idea that even enemies possessed inherent dignity, that even in conflict there were lines that must not be crossed, was foreign to her. And yet, she could not deny that this foreign idea had saved her life, as the weeks became months. The initial disbelief gave way to a more complicated set of emotions: gratitude, confusion, shame, curiosity. Takahashi began to attend the English classes offered in the camp, taught by volunteers from the education section. She learned vocabulary, grammar, simple phrases. The process of learning the enemy's language felt like a betrayal, but it also felt like liberation. Each new word opened a door to a different way of thinking. She read American magazines that circulated among the prisoners, glossy publications filled with advertisements for cars, refrigerators, cosmetics, luxury goods. The sheer excess was dizzying. She saw photographs of American families smiling, well-fed, dressed in clean clothes, living in houses with lawns and garages. She read articles about labor unions, women's suffrage, the GI Bill. She began to piece together a picture of a society that, for all its flaws, offered possibilities that had never existed in the world she had known. Other prisoners had similar awakenings. Sato Keiko, the radio operator, began working in the camp library, organizing books and assisting with literacy programs. She discovered American novels, stories about individuals who defied authority, who pursued their own dreams, who questioned the status quo. She was particularly struck by a book called The Grapes of Wrath, a story about poor families struggling during the Depression. Even in their suffering, she said to Takahashi one evening, they are allowed to complain. They are allowed to protest. They are allowed to demand better. In Japan, such a book would be banned, and its author would be imprisoned or executed. Takahashi agreed. She thought about the writers, artists, and intellectuals who had been silenced in Japan, the rigid censorship that controlled every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom. She thought about the thought police, the neighborhood associations, the constant surveillance. She had accepted it as necessary, as the price of unity and strength. But now, confronted with a society that tolerated dissent and still functioned, that thrived because it tolerated dissent, began to question whether that price had been too high. The transformation was not uniform. Some prisoners clung fiercely to their beliefs, refusing to accept that anything they had been taught was wrong. They insisted that the camp was an anomaly, a propaganda effort designed to weaken their resolve. They spoke of returning to Japan, of rebuilding the empire, of avenging their defeat. But they were the minority. Most of the women, like Takahashi, found themselves adrift, caught between a past that no longer made sense and a future that was uncertain. They grappled with guilt for surviving when so many had died. Guilt for accepting the enemy's generosity, guilt for doubting the ideology they had once embraced. But they also felt something else, something harder to name. Hope, possibility. The faint, fragile sense that perhaps there was a different way to live. The turning point came in the spring of 1946, when the camp organized a series of cultural exchange programs. American soldiers and Japanese prisoners were invited to share aspects of their respective cultures: music, dance, crafts, food. Takahashi, who had learned to play the koto as a child, was persuaded to perform. She sat on the stage in the camp's recreation hall, her fingers trembling as she plucked the strings. The music was delicate, melancholy, a traditional piece about the changing seasons. When she finished, the American audience applauded warmly. Then, a group of American soldiers took the stage with guitars and sang folk songs, their voices blending in harmonies that Takahashi had never heard before. The songs were about longing, home, love, loss. They were about the same emotions that filled Japanese music, but expressed in a different language, a different key. Takahashi realized, with a jolt, that the distance between her world and theirs was not as vast as she had believed. Beneath the uniforms, the flags, the languages, they were singing about the same human experiences. After the performance, an American sergeant approached her. He was young, perhaps 25, with red hair and a sunburned face. He extended his hand and said, through an interpreter, "That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing it." Takahashi shook his hand, startled by the gesture. In Japan, such physical contact between strangers, especially between men and women, would have been inappropriate. But here, it was a simple expression of respect. The sergeant smiled and walked away, and Takahashi stood there, her hand still tingling from the contact, feeling as though something inside her had shifted irrevocably. The food continued to be a source of astonishment. Even as the camp prepared for the eventual repatriation of prisoners, the rations did not diminish. If anything, they improved. The kitchens began serving desserts, cakes, pies, ice cream, luxuries that seemed almost obscene given the hunger that still gripped much of Asia. Takahashi watched as prisoners who had been skeletal upon arrival filled out, regained their strength, began to laugh again. She thought about the soldiers she had nursed in the Philippines, dying of starvation while their commanders insisted that surrender was dishonorable. She thought about the civilians she had seen in the final days of the war, scavenging for scraps, eating sawdust and acorns. And she thought about the casual abundance of this place, where food was so plentiful that waste was inevitable. It was a stark, undeniable illustration of the difference between the two societies. Japan had demanded total sacrifice, had squeezed every resource from its people until there was nothing left. America, it seemed, had so much that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. One evening, Takahashi was given a small notebook by one of the American social workers, a woman named Helen Kovacs who had been organizing creative writing workshops in the camp. "Write about your experiences," Helen said. "Write about what you've seen, what you've felt. It can help you make sense of it." Takahashi took the notebook hesitantly. Writing, like speaking, could be dangerous. But Helen assured her that whatever she wrote would remain private unless she chose to share it. That night, by the dim light of a single bulb, Takahashi began to write. She wrote about the transport ship, the fear that had consumed her, the certainty that she would die. She wrote about the first meal, the chocolate, the orange. She wrote about Captain Thornton, Grace Yamada, the cultural exchange, the sergeant's handshake. And as she wrote, she felt the weight of the past begin to lift, just slightly. The act of putting her experiences into words made them real, gave them shape, allowed her to see them more clearly. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she set down the pen and stared at the pages. They were filled with confusion, with questions, with the raw material of transformation. By the time the repatriation began in late 1946, Takahashi and many of the other female prisoners had been fundamentally changed by their captivity. They had not been broken or humiliated. They had not been subjected to the horrors they had been promised. Instead, they had been exposed to a different way of living, a different set of values, and they could not simply unsee what they had seen. When the day came to board the ships that would carry them back to Japan, the women gathered their few belongings, the notebooks, the English textbooks, the small gifts they had received from American personnel and prepared to return to a homeland that many of them no longer recognized. Japan was in ruins, occupied by the very forces that had imprisoned them, struggling to rebuild from the ashes of defeat. What would they find there? How would they fit into a society that had been shattered and remade? Takahashi stood on the deck of the repatriation ship as it pulled away from the dock. She looked back at the camp, at the barracks and guard towers and the American flag snapping in the wind. She thought about the months she had spent there, the lessons she had learned, the assumptions that had been overturned. She thought about the word Captain Thornton had used. Rights. Inalienable rights. Rights that did not depend on nationality, or loyalty, or usefulness. Rights that existed simply because one was human. It was a radical idea, an idea that had no place in the empire she had served. But it was an idea that had taken root in her mind, and she knew it would grow. The ship sailed through calm waters. Takahashi stood at the railing, watching the wake spread out behind them, white foam dissolving into blue. She thought about the orange she had been given on her first day in the camp. The sweetness that had overwhelmed her, the absurd generosity of it. She thought about how that single piece of fruit had represented everything she had not understood about the enemy, their wealth, their values, their capacity for kindness, even in the midst of war. And she thought about what she would do with this knowledge, how she would carry it forward into the uncertain future that awaited her. When the women arrived in Japan, they were processed through a reception center in Yokohama, where officials from the new democratic government installed and overseen by the American occupation interviewed them about their experiences. Takahashi told her story haltingly, unsure of what was safe to say. The interviewer, a middle-aged Japanese man who had been trained by American administrators, listened without judgment. "You were fortunate," he said. "Many prisoners of war did not receive such treatment. The Americans followed their laws, their principles. We are learning to do the same." Takahashi nodded. She understood what he was saying. Japan was being rebuilt, not just physically, but ideologically, reshaped according to the democratic ideals of its conquerors. It was a humiliation, a loss of sovereignty, but it was also an opportunity. The old order had led to disaster. Perhaps the new order, for all its foreign origins, offered something better. In the years that followed, Takahashi struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society. She found work as a translator, using the English she had learned in the camp to bridge the gap between the occupiers and the occupied. She married, had children, lived a quiet life, but she never forgot the camp, never stopped thinking about the contradictions it had revealed. She kept the notebook Helen Kovacs had given her, and sometimes, late at night, she would read the entries she had written, marveling at the naivety and the clarity of that younger self. She attended lectures about democracy, read books about human rights, joined women's organizations that advocated for equality and social reform. She became, in her own small way, a part of the transformation that swept through post-war Japan, the slow, painful process of building a society based on principles that had once been incomprehensible. Takahashi was not alone. Across Japan, former prisoners of war men and women who had spent time in American camps brought back stories that challenged the official narrative of the war. They spoke of fair treatment, adequate food, medical care, education. They spoke of a system that, while far from perfect, operated on principles of law and decency. Their stories were met with skepticism, with accusations of collaboration or brainwashing, but they persisted, and gradually, as Japan rebuilt and prospered under the post-war democratic constitution, as the economy grew and civil liberties expanded, the lessons of those prison camps began to make sense. The abundance that had seemed so alien, the rights that had seemed so abstract, became tangible realities. Japanese citizens, especially women, gained freedoms and opportunities that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. And those who had witnessed the American way of life firsthand understood, perhaps better than anyone, the profound shift that had occurred in 1975, nearly 30 years after her repatriation. Takahashi was invited to participate in a documentary about female prisoners of war. The filmmaker, a young Japanese woman born after the war, asked her to describe her experiences. Takahashi hesitated, then said, "I called it paradise. But that is not quite right. It was not paradise. It was simply a place where I was treated like a human being. That should not have been extraordinary. But it was, and that tells you everything you need to know about the world we had created, and the world we lost." The filmmaker pressed her. "Do you regret serving the empire?" Takahashi thought for a long moment. "I regret that I did not question it sooner. I regret that it took capture and defeat to open my eyes. But I do not regret surviving. I do not regret learning. And I do not regret carrying those lessons forward." The prison camps where Japanese women found unexpected humanity were not paradise. They were institutions of control, sites of confinement, symbols of defeat. But they were also spaces where fundamental assumptions were challenged, where rigid ideologies collided with stubborn facts, where individuals confronted the possibility of transformation. The women who passed through those camps carried their experiences forward into a new Japan, a democratic Japan, a Japan that would become one of America's closest allies and a model of post-war reconstruction. Their stories, often overlooked in the grand narratives of military campaigns and political negotiations, reveal the deeper currents that shaped the post-war world. They remind us that wars are not only won on battlefields but in the moral choices made in their aftermath, in the principles we uphold or abandon when we hold power over others. Takahashi Fumiko died in 2001. At the age of 7, her ashes were interred in a small cemetery in the countryside, under a cherry tree that bloomed every spring. At her funeral, her daughter spoke about her mother's life, about the war, the camp, the long journey of reconciliation and understanding. She read aloud from the notebook, and when she reached the passage about the orange, her voice broke. The mourners wept, not only for the woman they had lost, but for the world she had survived. The world she had helped to build, the world that remained fragile and precious and always in need of defenders. The orange, a simple fruit, distributed in a prison camp in 1945, a symbol of abundance, of generosity, of the possibility that even enemies deserve compassion. It represented everything Takahashi had not known about America, everything she had been taught to fear and despise. And in the end, it represented the truth that saved her, that human dignity is not conditional, that rights are not privileges, that civilization is measured not by how we treat our own, but by how we treat those who are at our mercy. The women who called American prison camps paradise were not mistaken or deluded. They were bearing witness to a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught, and they did so with clarity and courage. Their testimony remains a reminder that the values we claim to uphold are meaningless unless we practice them in the hardest moments, when it would be easier to give in to hatred or indifference. The orange, passed from American hand to Japanese hand in a camp somewhere in the Pacific, was more than food. It was a promise, a challenge, a question. What kind of world do we want to live in? What are we willing to sacrifice for it? And how will we treat those who stand on the other side of the conflict, when the fighting is done and the future remains to be written? That question echoes still, across the decades, across the wars that followed, across the ongoing struggle to build societies that honor human dignity. The answer, in the end, is not abstract. It is found in small gestures, in acts of decency, in the choice to see the humanity in the enemy and respond with compassion rather than cruelty. It is found in the memory of a young Japanese woman standing on the deck of a transport ship, terrified and resigned, who instead of death encountered life, and who carried that encounter forward into a world that would never be the same.